We'll start our webinar with a brief introduction to our speakers as usual, and then I'll hand over the stage to Andrey Iaremenko and Diego Szteinhendler for their presentations. And at the end, we'll hold a short Q&A to wrap everything up, where you'll get a chance to ask questions to our panelists on any topic you'd like, and they'll do their best to answer it. I'm joined now by Diego Szteinhendler.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Hi, Diego. Diego is the North American Senior Vice President of Business Development for Cyber and Intelligence Solutions at Mastercard, where he is responsible for sales and partnerships of authentication, fraud, AI, and general cyber solutions. Throughout his career, Diego has held roles at industry-leading financial companies like Discover and PayPal, as well as in fintech at startups like TransPay and CheckWow. Diego holds an MBA from the University of Texas and a degree in digital business leadership from Columbia University. Welcome, Diego. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
We're also joined here by Andrey Iaremenko, the CTO and co-founder of HUB Security. Hello, Andrey. I think you're muted, but I can get back to you.
Yeah. So hi, Shterny. Thank you all for joining us.
Nice to see you again. Andrey is the co-founder and CTO of HUB Security, a military-grade hardware security firm built by ex-IDF 8200 unit security experts. Andrey has a really vast technological background in software and hardware development and specializes in the architecture of complex software and hardware systems. During his 13 years of service in the IDF's 8200 elite unit, Andrey gained rich experience in managing RF design and manufacturing boards, embedded programming, FPGA design, hardware design, and implementation. Welcome, Andrey. We're so happy to have you here again.
Thank you.
I'll first hand over the stage to Diego, who will share with us some of his thoughts and insights on new and emerging cyber threats in the banking industry. And then maybe we'll hear a bit from Andrey on why security is so critical when it comes to protecting digital assets. So take it away, Diego.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm gonna try to share my screen and hopefully I don't mess up everything that we're doing here. Let me see. I think you need to enable it for me to do that. But in the meantime, I'll start talking and at some point I'll be able either to share my screen or to share the graphs later on. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how we at Mastercard are thinking of security and how we're evolving with what we're seeing in the environment. We are usually seen, and when people think of Mastercard, we're usually seen as a financial services company that is only addressing issues when it comes to a payment transaction. But the reality is that we have been way more than that, and we have been evolving to be even more than that as we recognize the vulnerabilities of the different ecosystems and the challenges that our stakeholders are having when it comes to a payment transaction. A lot of it coming from this evolution and migration of interactions and transactions going from a physical location where the opportunities for fraud and for a fraudulent scheme to scale quickly were completely different than what exists today when you're thinking of digital assets and the potential for scaling through software, through malware, and through other methods that could really influence the different enterprises and different systems that are all across. So that's really where we're heading. So if you start thinking of why are we doing this, you can start looking at some of the latest breaches that exist or that have happened. And I'm going to be a little bit US centric, but I'm pretty sure that this you have seen all over the world. And I know we have people from different countries on the line, but several of them have been huge in North America and probably have resonated in other places. We've seen companies that we all recognize, like Microsoft and Facebook and some big hotel chains like Marriott and Target getting breached through the vulnerabilities that they have either within their ecosystem or within a third-party vendor that allows access eventually to a breach for fraudsters to steal credentials. Then those credentials end up in the dark web, eventually being used in most cases for payment or to act on behalf of someone else to get some financial gain out of it. And that's when we started to see, well, we have a much bigger role within this ecosystem than just protecting that transaction. Because if we're not protecting the initial interactions and the systems that are around the data that it's being collected, then we're really failing our stakeholders. And that's what we're moving towards. Some of the thinking, and if you all start thinking of how life has evolved the last 10 years, but even more so in the last few months with the pandemic, where the evolution to digital has been accelerated. If you think of how many records of data are being kept by all of these digital players that we're interacting with on a single minute, right? So I had a graph that I'll show later, but there are over 41 million messages exchanged on WhatsApp on every single minute. Where's that data going? I know WhatsApp is encrypted, but as you start thinking of any other interaction with Amazon, with Netflix, with LinkedIn, with Facebook, with Uber, all that information is being captured somewhere. It includes, in some case, personal information that needs to be kept secure. It includes payment credentials that need to be secure. So all that really becomes part of the assets that we want to protect that eventually could affect our main stakeholders, both consumers as well as merchants and issuers that Mastercard talks about on a regular basis. Drilling down a little bit more into what we usually discuss across Mastercard, we've seen during the pandemic an increase in the cybercrime that has been reported to the FBI, 300% increase during the pandemic. So a massive increase in vulnerabilities. Obviously, hackers know that we're all working from home. They know that a lot of companies don't have the best security to protect all of their assets and resources working from home and having all these connections that are really stressing the systems of different companies. And they are going at it like it's a party, basically. We'll also have the realization of the future of IoT, connected devices. And you would think, why Mastercard and connected devices? But as you start thinking of the evolution of payments, and even today, in some countries where Alexa and Amazon has already enabled voice payments, you can be in your house and pay through a device that is not necessarily you holding a card. It's not necessarily you having the device in your hand like a phone. It's just something that's in your house that someone could pay through. And eventually it will be your car paying through and having a payment credential in it. It will be your fridge maybe asking for more milk when you run out of milk and making that payment transaction on your behalf. And all those devices that will hold payment information and personal information will need to be protected. Then there is the realization, what I was saying at the beginning, of fraud and how much you can scale fraud in the digital world and how the physical world has been protected. So you're all familiar with the chip that has been placed on the cards, and that really has diminished fraud in the physical world when it comes to payments. And payments have migrated online because it's easier than trying to crack each of the chips on the card, and it also scales faster. So we see 4 times more fraud on the digital world than what we see in the physical world. Then we have how people are starting to crack into credentials and accounts. So it's not only about the payment credential that you have stolen through a breach, but it's also, can I actually start breaching into systems and stealing accounts, or create a synthetic ID to breach into a system and act as if I were someone else. And we, through some of the solutions that we have acquired in the last couple of years, we see that 80% of account takeovers start a login. So how do we protect those logins, whether that is a login of a bank, which obviously for obvious reasons is protecting critical information in the back end. But it could be you login for Amazon that also holds a payment credential or holds your address or holds other assets that are of relevance. And if you keep going, you can talk about healthcare and other industries that probably hold very critical information for individuals. The last one within our payment of value today, that just to give you a sense, is when it comes to chargebacks. And chargebacks is that instance in which someone makes a payment. We probably have seen it where you see a payment in your statement and you say that wasn't me. But what is going on now with the digital world and a lot of this recurring payments, think of gaming, things of iTunes, Netflix, and others, households are using shared payment credentials. And in some cases, it's either a child or actually a person saying that wasn't me. So we see 50% of those chargebacks, people calling a bank and saying that wasn't me, being friendly fraud, meaning it actually was that person or someone within the household. So our strategy is based on looking at all these threat vectors and all these different areas of fraud that are affecting the interaction, that are affecting our stakeholders, and are really damaging the overall experience of commerce. And how do we fix them? And that's really how we've been evolving. We have really focused on 3 areas where we either have addressed the problem with internal product development or have acquired other companies or are moving towards protecting. That is, one is cyber, and it's this idea of overly protecting the ecosystems. We recently acquired a company called Risk Recon that allows our stakeholders to have an assessment of potential vulnerabilities that someone can have through themselves, right? So part of their infrastructure being online that is not protected, that maybe there wasn't the proper update on the software or any other vulnerability there, either through them or through a third-party vendor. So a lot of the things that you're seeing now online is people are using SaaS vendors or multiple connections, and they might have access to your digital infrastructure, and through that is that a threat or a malware or a hacker could come into your infrastructure. So that's something that we're looking at on a regular basis. And we're also looking at the overall ecosystem of payment transactions, obviously, and using it to recognize patterns and to prevent attacks that could spill into other regions or into other banks. So that's part of a small part of what we're doing when it comes to cyber. The other area is when it comes to digital, and these investments that allows us to either recognize patterns on a digital environment once a consumer or a bot or a malware or a hacker tries to interact or access into an account. I talked a little bit about account takeover, and this functionality through behavioral biometrics allows us to recognize the right user coming in. Within the same framework of digital, we go into authentication of payments, authentication of people during a payment transaction or before a payment transaction. We talk a lot about connected intelligence, which is this idea of using all this data we see on a merchant as someone starts interacting with the merchant, but being able to share that information with the issuer, with the bank that has provided the payment credential, so that when you're sending your information as a consumer, the bank has as much information as possible to make the right decision. And that right decision is stop the transaction that is not coming from the right person, and let the transaction that is coming from the right person, if the funds are available and they're in good standing, go through. Because we've all been declined for sure when we were trying to make a payment and we never know what's the reason, right? And these are all models that are working constantly, and we also provide those models and have made acquisitions on artificial intelligence to make those models that banks use smarter. But it's the models and it's the amount of data that we're making and sending through to make this collaboration more efficient. The last part that I'm going to touch within this strategy is the chargeback piece. And I talked about friendly fraud and that 50% of chargebacks coming from people that actually made the transaction. We also acquired a company called Ethica last year, I believe, that allows us to create a layer of collaboration in between merchants and banks, so that the amount of those disputes that consumers are bringing is reduced by telling on the back end through alerts that the transaction that just happened was not done by or done by the proper person, and stopping the shipment of those goods if possible. So sometimes when someone is calling and disputing a transaction, that might happen before the goods and services were provided, and you can still stop that, or there could be some sort of resolution on the back end, reducing the cost of the normal flow of that resolution, which used to happen in the past, right? Those are not cheap processes to just, when someone calls and says, hey, those $5, that wasn't me, it's not a cheap process. So the more we have a collaboration and sharing of information, it's key to maintain and protect those environments. Lastly, and things that we're thinking for the future when it comes to security, when it comes to cyber, when it comes to digital, is a little bit of what I mentioned at the beginning, when we start seeing the vulnerabilities and the different pieces that could hold a payment credential, that could act on behalf of us. We started to think about how do we maintain trust when we set up a payment credential, when we talk about trust even one level up, right? So let me back up a little bit. Talk about trust when you're interacting with a company. How do I trust the company that I'm interacting with, and what are the solutions that Mastercard could provide to that company so they're properly secured? And I talk about cyber and vulnerabilities and what we do there. Then how can we provide trust to a consumer as you're giving away part of their information and their payment credentials? And how do we not only establish trust, but maintain that trust throughout all of the interactions that are happening in between that consumer, the bank, the merchant, etc. The last piece, and we've published a manifesto on this, is digital identity. So as you're thinking of trust, as you're thinking of enabling security, as you're thinking of the future of all these devices, having a portable digital identity will become critical, in which individuals will be able to share information but without disclosing all of their information. And if you have been following the news and you saw the iPhone iOS 14 this week, you probably saw that one of the key updates was about how much information you're sharing with different apps. And I think this is something that we will keep seeing as an evolution, and where we're also participating and trying to help construct that network that will share information, but it's just the information that is needed. You don't need to know my date of birth when you're only trying to check if I'm over 18 or over 25. You only need to know the answer to that question. You don't need the full information. And that's kind of the essence of this idea of a digital identity, and how much of it to share with different stakeholders. I'll stop there because otherwise I'll take the full hour, but I want to see what Andrey has to say on some of these topics.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diego. It was super interesting to hear what you guys are up to at Mastercard, how you guys are working to prevent fraud and to fight cyber attacks. We're definitely living in a digital age that's really uncertain. So I mean, I think I'll leave Andrey to speak a bit more about this, and maybe he will touch on quantum proofing, which is the next threat in the cyber era. But Andrey, why don't you take it away? We'd love to hear some thoughts from you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Shterny, and thanks a lot, Diego, for talking about many cyber issues and topics that are really relevant for cybersecurity and for identity security. And I actually want to start with what you mentioned during your talk. It's two things. First thing is about trust. And the second is about keeping a strong identity during payments or during handling of any kinds of digital asset. So when in this day and age and in the coming years, our machines like frigiders and cars and other smart devices hold our identity and hold our payment details, then how can we trust them to really do only the normal transactions and execute only approved and good payments, and how we can secure them against malicious hackers and actors that want to steal our money, and also to save lots of money for the credit companies on canceling transactions, for example. So when machines hold the credentials and they can pay instead of us, and they are essentially connected 24/7 to the internet and can order anything from everywhere, then the security of the identity inside the car or inside the washing machine or inside our smart home automation becomes critical. And on the other hand, the security of the Wi-Fi networks or cellular networks is not that good. Usually all these devices that are starting to do payments are not designed with security in mind. They are designed for extremely low cost and just to do their own functionality. So when adding passwords and credit card numbers into these devices, it becomes very risky because it's very easy for hackers to go into the Wi-Fi network and, for example, for the smart home, and from there go into the smart car or into the smart device inside.
You're right, and not to scare the people that join us, but there's a lot of research being done on baby monitors and how people can hack into baby monitors and what happens afterwards, right? So I totally agree with you.
Yeah, definitely. Like there are many funny cases, like which are actually not so funny. I think 2 years ago, a company manufactured the smart kettle with Wi-Fi, so you can start boiling when you are still on the road. And the hacker in a conference succeeded to get the Wi-Fi password from the home network from a direct connection to this wireless connection to this kettle. And from there, you are inside the network, you can do anything you want. So everything is exposed. So it's a really big problem today. And this is something that is generally called IoT, Internet of Things devices. Today it's wide open, and it's a big challenge how to create secure enclaves, how to add really high-grade security, which is equivalent or very close to security of credit cards, chips, or security of the credit card payment terminals, for example, which is on very high level, into these normal standard consumer devices. So I think this is something that is not solved yet. It just people are starting to think about and incorporate into design of this kind of devices. And it's very, very nascent stage, very initial stages of development. And this is something that we here in HUB Security have been thinking a lot about, how to provide this really strong identity and keep the integrity of the identity on the edge, on all these machines that generate lots of data, private data, secret data, and also make payments. So the manufacturers can actually incorporate an existing secure enclaves into their products instead of investing lots of time and money into design of the secure enclaves, design of the payment compliant, PCI compliant solutions inside the very low cost products where the competition is about cents, essentially. So think it's something that is maybe complements the ideas, Diego, that you've mentioned before, is we are looking more on the endpoints and on the devices and the endpoints where the transactions are being generated, even before they come out, before they go into the Mastercard, the security and AI and all the analysis, to stop the fraud at its starting point. So the hacker cannot do payment initially by misusing or stealing the credentials. So we'll save lots of cost and money to the credit card companies and banks and all the ecosystem that processes payments. So that's the first thing, is how to keep the identity secure on the edge devices. And this is something that we provide here in our company, is a ready secure enclave, which can be incorporated in any kind of machine, any kind of smart device, and provide this secure functionality and secure payment functions completely isolated and separated from the normal networks. So then anything can do payments and keep the identity secure and keep the transactions real and legit, essentially. So in this way, minimize the fraud. And I think that's only one part of the equation, as I see it. The second part is the trust, end-to-end trust. So on the one end, there are users and smart devices which have the payment identity, and on the other side there are banks and which must process these payments and actually take money from users' accounts. And we are also to create the best level of trust. It's not enough only to be on the user side, on the endpoint side. It's also the security is also needed on the bank side, on the processor side, which actually transfers the real money between accounts, between the buyers and the sellers of the transactions, of the payment transactions. And here, this is also, we are seeing a very large vulnerabilities where lots of money is stolen from banks, from inside the banking networks by hacker attacks, like phishing attack by stealing credentials. It's a very, very big thing where they just steal credentials of the bank officers and they can go into the payment network and create false transactions inside the bank. So in this way, they steal large amounts of money. So it is something that is needed to also handle and save and keep the identities also on the payment processor side, on the bank side, in a secure way. So only the identified and legally signed payments that are recognized by the bank are actually being made through to the actual transfer of money at the end. And nobody else can go and create, for example, a new payment identity, a new credit card, which is not real and not really recognized by the bank, and still do payments, for example. And so there are 2 points in any security. One is on the user side, on the payee side, and the other one is on the data center in the payment processor that needs to keep securely the identities, the roles, and also the permissions of what is legit payments. And in this case, I think the standard security procedures and policies, they are not enough as we see this. Because today, what happens is that the keys and are kept inside secure enclaves, inside the HSM modules, and that's the only thing that is kept securely. All the other stuff, which are the payment processing applications, the fraud detecting applications inside the bank network, are actually running on the regular servers inside the data center, which are very easily hacked. So we know of the use cases, some of them are being made public, that the hackers, they don't actually steal the keys to the payments. They just override the fraud detection and the payment approval applications, and do the transactions directly with the secure enclaves by impersonating the security officers and making it very, very easy to steal the money.
Yeah,
So
important to mention on that comment that those are SWIFT payments, right? In the majority, the ones that you're mentioning, just so that people that are listening to us understand the difference in between the payment transaction with a card versus the big movements of money of bank to bank and the SWIFT, which also has had many news about it being breached, but we're just making a point there.
Yeah, so definitely the majority of the hacking attempts is about the big payments, because then it's payoff is much larger. This however exposes also another issue, that secure enclaves today, they can be hacked. So also the payment HSMs, they something that is can be hacked. And the thing is, when banks or like payment processors, they're adding actual applications, very complicated applications to handle payments, to approve payments, to manage payments, then any change in the flow for any kind of digital asset transfer can be substantial for hackers. Even small changes can aggregate over time, and result in big money transfers. So it's important also today to run not only the actual PIN processing inside the HSM when we're talking about payments, but also the applications that do the analysis and stop the PIN processing from happening, because this is the actual payment moment.
We had a few questions come in as you were speaking, Andrey, and I think that probably because people have follow-up questions to what you're saying, as well as for Diego. And I think maybe you can answer this as we begin to go through them a bit more about what companies can do to secure those cryptographic keys from getting in the wrong hands. I spoke about the secure enclaves, but what is necessary in order for digital assets to stay safe and protected. So I want to maybe we have a few questions coming in. Maybe I'll just start shooting them off. And we'll see if any of them stick. So I'm gonna start with a question from Hanit. And for all our attendees, if you see below in the menu section, you have a Q&A icon. You can just hit that and send a question. If it's for one of the moderators, specific moderator, You can just indicate who it's for, and we'll try to get through all the questions. So we have a question here from Hanit. Thank you for joining. And this is for Diego. Diego, there is a huge shift in mindset among the millennials that are more willing to share their personal information, which seems to be driving the requirement for all of us to share more and more personal information. I've chosen not to download apps that require more information than I believe they need, as an example, but these apps already have a lot of subscribers. Is Mastercard addressing these instances where digital merchants you're working with are collecting personal information that may not be relevant to reducing cyber risk?
Yeah.
This is a great question about data privacy and super relevant.
Yeah, so two parts to it. So depending where your hearing is from, there are regulations about data privacy. So if you're in Europe and other countries, there are regulations. In the US, there isn't one. California has kind of like their own thing. But we, as a payments company, do not rule within what is being collected. Though what we do, and in this market, there are standards and regulation about compliance with holding payment credentials and the form in which they need to be held, the PCI compliance. There's also the move that Mastercard and all the networks are doing towards tokenization, which means the payment credential itself is now being held by the merchant. It is a token. So if that payment credential were to be stolen, then really they're not stealing anything that can be used anywhere else. So that's how we're protecting that part. And the other one is about protecting you from your credential being used by someone else. So I talked about account takeover. So if your account were to be taken over and someone wanted to make purchases on your behalf, then we have a solution to authenticate that payment, which means that as the merchant and your bank are interacting with that payment transaction, there is information that is being sent through. And if this doesn't look like you making the payment, they might ask you a question. They might create friction to ask you a question to make sure that the right person is making that transaction. If, depending again where you're at, you might have heard of secure code and might have used it, that in the past had kind of like a bad experience with how it was used. But now it's moving towards biometrics. So you will get prompted to put your biometric face, finger, voice, something else. And then that will create an authentication on that payment for your bank to approve the transaction. So we're protecting in different ways, but we're not ruling over the data that is being collected necessarily.
Okay, thank you, Diego. Another one for Diego here, talking about chargebacks. How does a company or organization get around or better enhance the process of having to deal with merchants and waiting on merchants to verify charges that are being disputed by the consumer?
Is this, I think I'm missing information there, but how do you make that process better? So the process of chargebacks is well structured by each of the networks. They each have their own process. What we're building is through this acquisition of Ethica, different layers that can enhance the process. So in some of the examples that I mentioned, what ends up happening and the way you enhance the process is by the process not even happening. So the minute that someone disputes a transaction and alert gets sent to the merchant might either provide a benefit if that was the case or cancel the transaction. So the dispute process on the back end that we as consumers never get to see, but that's costly to manage for both banks and merchants, gets eliminated. I'm sure many of you remember that if you were to dispute a transaction on a certain amount in the past, they would just give it away, no questions asked, and that was part of how costly it was just to go through the process. So just by eliminating the costs and the time that the process used to take, that is one way. The other one that we're moving towards is by providing more information on the statement. And this might sound like not rocket science, but a lot of identifiers of merchants, and especially now when you think of marketplaces that are growing, are not very clear. So many times you might have seen on your statement, let's call it $30 for a merchant that you do not recognize, but that might be only because the name of the merchant wasn't clear. So we're starting to also connect through that layer and provide more information in the statement. And we see a lot of friendly fraud being eliminated just by providing more information to the consumer.
Great. The next question I have here is a two-part question. The first part is for Andrey, and a follow-up to that is for Diego. For Andrey, what security threats do you see with open banking? And as a follow-up to that for Diego is, what is Mastercard doing to reduce those threats?
So threats on open banking, was that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let's start with Andrey. So what are some security threats that you see for open banking currently and in the future?
So I think it's the main thing is that if you're talking about open banking, it's opening the identity on the user side to be more flexible one, and it makes easier for hackers to connect and to impersonate the user, to impersonate the origin of transaction to steal the money. And that's one of the main things, one of the main threats. So then, essentially, it becomes an issue of risk and value management. So for standard transactions, for standard use, the biometric identification, maybe the mobile phone secure identification is enough, and for more high value, high risk transactions or use of a private user data or a sharing of private financial data, then it is much more sensitive issue. How do you open the access without exposing the private information to the hackers? And it requires much better and strict management of secrets, I think on the data center side, on the central bank or central organization side, which handles all the data.
Right. I think you mentioned some of them. I think others are around if the credentials were stolen and you're matching someone, there's something to be said about the information that exists within a device, within a connection, location, behavioral biometrics, etc. That's probably part of it. There's another one, and again, this is a topic that varies by country. There's regulation in Europe, there's no regulation in the US. It's like a whole different answer depending where you live. But a lot of the open banking, at least in this market, was being done with screen scraping, which is not the most secure way. And also the availability of data that was being collected at the individual banks was not, it's still not standard, but also in many cases, it's more than what you would think that they were collecting, right? So if you were just pairing, you had someone ask a question about Venmo, if you were just pairing your Venmo up to your bank, you might just think that they're pairing up to see how much money you had to send, but they might be seeing a lot more than that. So I can see a move towards, and it already started, a move from screen scraping into more secure API connections and more clarity on the data that is being collected and for purpose. And just to answer quickly, there was a question if I guess it's for me, if we have an app like Venmo and Zillow, I don't know Zillow, but we power a lot of those things. So if you think of when people use Venmo with a card, we're in the back end, we're putting money to a debit card or a bank that might be Mastercard. If you say CH based in this market, we don't yet participate, but in other markets, let's call it in the UK, we own Vocaling, which is the ACH powering feature. So it really depends by market. We don't own an app per se, but we have acquired assets that allows for money transfers on one-to-one through the banking rails that are not the card rails. It's very important for us to move into other rails outside of the card. And we've also acquired assets that allow for P2P transfers cross-border. So we acquired a company called Transfast that has a feature called TransPay as well. And this allows for either business to person or person to person transfers from one country to the other.
Great, thank you. Next, cryptocurrency liquidity is at risk. Can you handle it? Assuming this is directed towards Diego.
We are not a bank, so we don't do any of that stuff. We have several patents on blockchain. We are working on several projects on blockchain. That's not in my area, but there's a lot of public information on that. And we actually work with some companies on cryptocurrency. I think we did something, but through a debit card as you're converting the money into proper fiat. We don't do liquidity. That's not, we don't lend money. We're a technology company that connects the dots from one place to another to help people and commerce be more efficient, faster, and secure.
I have another question here. I'm trying to understand where this all fits in with HSMs or hardware security modules. Can somebody please clarify? Maybe Andrey can answer this, and maybe Diego can give a little bit of also some insight on how Mastercard leverages HSMs in their cybersecurity process.
Yeah, sure. So HSM is essentially a hardware-based secure enclave that can be a large appliance that sits in the data center, or it can be a very small module, very small device that can be in a car, that can be in any kind of existing small or small-based or home-based device. And the main function of the HSM is to keep the secret keys, to keep the digital identity of the user secret and isolated from the external network, from the internet. So nobody can steal your identity. So nobody can use your keys, your encryption keys or authentication keys without your explicit permission. And you are the only one that can do this. And it is based on hardware, usually, because only in this way, with dedicated hardware implementation, you can achieve the level of security that is required for the high levels of risk which are involved in payments in digital asset transactions.
I would say on my end, and can you hear me well? Because I saw a couple of comments that I'm choppy.
At the moment, I think it's much better.
Okay. This is not my area. I'm on the core side of the business, what we provide to our stakeholders. This should be on the area of our internal cybersecurity and how we protect our own systems. So that's beyond me and not an area that I work on.
Okay, great. Well, I think we are going to wrap up in just a few minutes, but I'm just going to throw you a final question. You talked about the evolution of fraud in the payment landscape. What are one of the things that has changed? You mentioned one of the things that has changed, which is the move from the 3DS. Yes. Can you just explain maybe the core differences between?
Right, and you were recording, it might be my internet. You said a move on 3DS, something? Is that what you mentioned? Yeah,
you talked about the evolution of fraud in the payments landscape, and one of the things that you had mentioned in your presentation or in your talk was about the move from 3DS to EMV 3DS. And
Yeah.
verify for our audiences what the differences are.
3DS is a protocol for payment authentication online. That's what I mentioned. Mastercard used to call it secure code. Visa used to call it secure by Visa or something like that. It's a protocol that, just like the chip on the card, it is a standard. It's an industry standard that all networks use to authenticate payments online. The new protocol is faster. It collects a lot more data than before, like 10 times plus the amount of data. And it's leveraging a lot of the variables that you can see online to make sure that as you authenticate a payment, you're authenticating the right person. It also reduces the latency and the friction that existed within that process. So in many markets, it wasn't used, or it was limited, the use of it, because of the bad experience that it brought to commerce. And as you think of how seamless commerce is today, even you think of an Uber ride, no one thinks about the payment, but the most magical thing about the ride is how it gets to you and then how you pay. Just leave the car and no one knows. Authenticating and using all that data becomes important, and not creating friction within that magical process of riding a car and not paying is critical. So that those are part of the changes. If you live in Europe, I'm sure you're familiar with the regulation. It's called PSD2, the Payment Service Directive 2, which requests for strong consumer authentication. To comply with that, most of the payments, there are many different nuances to it, but are using this protocol to comply to it and authenticate and deliver strong consumer authentication.
Thank you, Diego. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you to our speakers, Andrey Iaremenko and Diego Szteinhendler. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy at home. And we look forward to hosting many more discussions like these in the future. Just to stay up to date on upcoming webinars, you can follow HUB Security on LinkedIn and on Twitter, or wherever you like to get your social media from. You can also check out HUB's weekly digest on Medium for the latest stories coming out of the blockchain, banking, and crypto sphere. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for joining. Stay safe and stay healthy. Stay inside if you need to, and we hope to see you next week.